We are here today with Dr. Bill Longbrake, Executive in Residence at the Center for Financial Policy at the University of Maryland. Dr. Longbrake publishes a monthly letter called the Longbrake Letter, which is published on our website, that deals with global macroeconomic issues. And now he is here today to speak about some of the issues that he brings up in his March letter. Thank you for joining us here today.
Oh, you're welcome, Michelle. Glad to be here.
Thanks. So you opened this month's letter with a discussion about the crisis in the Middle East and North African region. In the past recent weeks, we've seen a number of different developments, including the start of international airstrikes in Libya and political unrest in other regions such as Bahrain and Yemen and also Syria and Jordan. Can you speak a little bit about these issues and why they are so worrisome for the world economic order?
Well, certainly I'd be glad to speak about what's going on in the Middle East right now. Essentially, as we speak here, nothing's really changed. The issues are continuing to bubble and boil. It seems like every day in Libya, it's either the rebels are gaining or the government's gaining. And now we're hearing about Syria. The situation's getting more serious there, Yemen, Bahrain, and so forth. So the situation really has not changed in any material degree. But what's interesting is that the market has relaxed quite a bit. And when you look at the VIX index, for example, it's come down, and that's a measure of volatility, and it's sort of a measure of anxiety in the market. And what I'm saying is the market anxiety is diminished. Now, is that something that makes sense? Not necessarily, but what the market has determined is that the bump in the price of oil, Brent's oil is about $115 a barrel right now, and West Texas Intermediate's about 105, and that's about 20% higher than it was at the beginning of the year. That is a significant increase, but what the market has determined is it's not such a big increase that it's going to do severe damage to the global economies. The risk then, if you want to extend that, is that the problems in the Middle East continue to boil, and perhaps they boil over, and oil prices go a lot higher. And so that's what the crisis is all about from the economic setting, is where will oil prices go. If they stay at current levels, that does a little damage. It slows global growth a bit, but not enough to really take things off of a trend. So we'll just have to stay tuned and see what happens.
Sure, thank you so much. Turning to the United States, you define self-sustaining growth as economic expansion that can continue on its own momentum with diminishing assistance from the government. Do the recent shocks in the Middle East and Japan, along with the Fed's second round of quantitative easing scheduled to end at the end of June, threaten the U.S.'s chances of realizing this self-sustaining growth?
Well, Michelle, I'd be happy to try to answer that question, but it's a very complex one to answer, so let me do a little stage setting first. If we turn the clock back a couple of years, actually 3 years ago to 2008, we had this financial meltdown and global economic crisis. And for a while, we feared that the world would go into another Great Depression. What we now know is that did not happen, but one of the reasons it didn't happen is governments across the globe reacted very strongly by providing liquidity to financial institutions, doing bailouts, and in the United States and many other countries, cutting taxes and increasing expenditures. In other words, to provide economic support to the common man, to the population, to the consumer, to keep spending and keep the economy propped up. And that worked. And quantitative easing was one of the tools of that response. The other tool that the Fed used was to reduce the interest rates to zero. That wasn't sufficient, and so putting additional liquidity into the economy through quantitative easing was something that actually has had a very powerful effect in stimulating the economy. So that's what happened, and it helped us avoid depression. Now, one would have hoped that by now all of that medicine would have been sufficient to really get the U.S. economy going again. But it is stumbling along. It's in a very fragile condition. Let me cite some of the reasons. We have housing that actually seems to be into a double dip. housing prices declining, sales declining, construction declining. It's not a healthy situation. We still have a very high rate of unemployment. Yes, employment's been improving a bit, and we've had some good numbers come out recently, but the fact of the matter is that there are a lot of people still unemployed. Then state and local governments across the country, not in every state, but in many states, are under severe stress, and they're cutting back on spending and they're cutting back on employment. And then finally here, more recently, we've had an explosion in food and energy prices, oil that we just talked about a moment ago, and that's putting real constraints on consumer budgets, and it's actually having a pretty negative effect on consumer confidence. So these are all drags. These are things that say, hey, the economy is not particularly healthy yet. But to add to that now, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, we have the Congress talking about cutting spending so that the fiscal benefits of increasing spending are about to be reversed. We have the quantitative easing, as you mentioned, about to end, and that stimulus then will be withdrawn. And so the question really becomes, do we have enough momentum that's built up in the recovery to keep it going in light of all these headwinds that I mentioned as we take away the government support? My sense is yes, but it's a very fragile situation. So the shocks that you mentioned, the oil shock, again, if the oil prices go a lot higher, it will have some pretty severely negative consequences for the U.S. economy. As it now stands, it's not a positive, but it probably isn't enough to tip things over again. The Japanese situation doesn't look nearly as troublesome. You know, there's been discussion about interruptions in the supply chain and so forth, but for the U.S. economy, only 5% of our exports go to Japan. And so it's really a fairly minor thing. You hear these stories about auto supply parts and so forth, but you have to put it into the context that it's a much bigger situation, and the Japanese situation really isn't that consequential. But the whole point would be the economy is still fragile. It's in a recovery mode. It is gaining momentum. We're withdrawing stimulus. That makes the economy especially vulnerable to any new negative shock, and that's what we'll have to watch for. So I'm guardedly optimistic, I think, is my bottom line.
Okay, fair enough. Bill, you spoke briefly about spending cuts that are being discussed in Congress right now, and obviously that is a hot topic as we go into the month of April, and that now we can turn, I think, to the continued showdown in Congress about these spending cuts. Lawmakers have until April 8th, as you know, to pass a new spending plan to avoid a government shutdown. Three issues are really on the table right now, as I think: the continuing resolution, the debt ceiling, and next year's fiscal budget, which lawmakers have aimed to confirm by April 15th. Can you provide some insight about these developments in Congress and also your predictions?
Well, I'll try to provide some insights. Predictions are easy, but they're not necessarily right.
Sure.
So we'll see what the passage of time has to say on the predictions. Let's again take a step back. One of the things that we know is that the U.S. deficit is huge. It's close to 10% of GDP, and it's not something that's sustainable, and that's understood by politicians of both the Democratic and Republican parties. Nonetheless, they're in a continual competition with each other for political advantage, and so that leads to different views on how best to deal with the deficit problem over the long run. So we then have, as you mentioned here, these three pieces that are currently in play, but it's very much a political story at the moment, with this intent long run to do something about getting the deficit under control. As I mentioned a moment ago, if stimulus is withdrawn too much, too quickly, it could have a negative effect on the economy, and the Democrats constantly raise that as an issue. The Republicans have focused more on the government is spending in ways that are not helping the economy, and we ought to reduce that spending as quickly as possible, and oh, by the way, that will help the deficit. So let's first of all talk about the continuing resolution. This is for fiscal year 2011, which began on the 1st of October 2010. And so here we are more than 6 months into the fiscal year, and we're still doing continuing resolutions. Normally the process would be that the Congress would adopt a budget resolution by the 15th of April of the year before the fiscal year starts, not the 15th of April the year after the fiscal year starts, okay? And then what the process is the various committees of Congress that have jurisdiction over different parts of the budget would then take that continuing resolution as guidance and actually put together very specific budgets. That's the normal process. So here we are. We do not have the normal process for fiscal year 2011. We've been doing stopgap continuing resolutions. There's been several of them. And as you pointed out, we do have the most recent one expiring on the 8th of April. To further set the stage, the House of Representatives passed a resolution now back in February, several weeks ago, that would have continued funding for the government through the end of the fiscal year with $61 billion in spending cuts. That was not acceptable to the Senate, and so there was not concurrence on the two houses of Congress. So far, there's been 2 continuing resolutions passed. One reduced spending by $4 billion and another by 6. So we have 10 of that 61 reduced so far. What the administration, President Obama and Senate Democrats are proposing is another $20 billion in cuts, which would take it to a total of 31. That is not acceptable to many of the Republicans who are holding steadfast for the full 61. Mm-hmm. So now you have the stage set potentially for stalemate, and there has been talk about the possibility of government shutdown. Now, government shutdown is not something that could last for very long. It just simply would not be a tolerable situation. But it could occur just as a part of the poker game that's being played here in terms of trying to obtain political advantage. And here's my prediction now. My prediction on the continuing resolution is that it will get resolved, probably short of actually shutting down the government, although it's going to be a close call, and that the spending cuts eventually will be somewhere in the total of 40 to 45 billion. So not the 31 that supposedly the president is willing to accept, a little higher than that, but not the 61. Doesn't that sound like sort of a classic compromise?
Certainly, somewhere in the
middle. Might be logical,
middle.
so probably that means it won't happen, but that would be my best prediction at this point. Now, let's go on to the second one, the debt ceiling, because that's totally separate, but that has to do with the ability of the U.S. Treasury to borrow money to finance federal spending. And that debt ceiling will get hit sometime in the month of April, probably towards the end of April. That's not the kind of a drop-dead date because the Treasury can deploy a number of different accounting strategies to buy about 60 days of time. And so the real deadline is probably the end of June. But if the budget ceiling is not raised by that time, then you have more than a government shutdown. You have a government that can't pay its bills, and that actually will have financial market implications. So that will not occur either. Somehow there will be a solution before you reach that kind of final hour, but it probably will extend out right to the end of June or very close to it. There is a move afoot in the Senate, among the 47 Republicans in the Senate, to actually, as a price for increasing the debt ceiling, having a vote on a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. And so we'll see if that transpires. Then the third piece of this is to go back to the budget process itself, would be to actually meet the April 15th deadline for fiscal year 2012 by passing a resolution. And there is a group of Republicans in the House of Representatives that does want to do that. And I think there's a pretty good chance that the House of Representatives will pass, much less of a chance that the Senate will do anything at this particular point in time. And so my prediction there will be is you will have something very specific on the table from the House, nothing from the Senate, and we'll then see how this game plays out on fiscal 2012 over the next several months. But it is reported that the House will pass a resolution that has significant cuts in spending, but they will also attack entitlements such as Medicaid.
So we spoke about some issues that have been fairly hot topics in the media lately, the Middle East political crisis, the U.S. budget crisis. With that, I feel like investors have been paying little attention to the continuing European sovereign debt crisis. And we've seen a few significant events this week. First, the resignation of Portugal's PM after losing a key vote for his austerity plan in the parliament. The close of the EU summit on Friday with an agreement to create a permanent bailout fund of 500 billion euro, but little detail beyond that. And yesterday, S&P's downgrade of Portugal and Greece's bond ratings. What are the long-term consequences if investors are not paying enough attention to these continuing developments?
Well, let me just say flat out to begin with, Michelle, that the current situation is not going to resolve itself without intervention. In fact, I will be so bold as to say that ultimately Greece will have to restructure its debt, which means taking a haircut. That means losses to somebody, and good chance that that will also occur in Ireland. Furthermore, I would just say that Portugal is an accident waiting to happen, and it will require intervention from the European Financing Stability Fund to help support their government debt, and probably sooner than later. So it is a mystery to me as to why the markets are totally ignoring Europe. Perhaps it's because they're preoccupied with the Middle East, with this era of good feelings about the economic recovery in the United States and strengthening employment and so forth. But it is an accident that will happen. It's just a matter of time. So, for example, in Greece, you mentioned the S&P reduced their credit rating. It was from BB plus to BB minus. And for those who kind of understand the rating games that's played, BB minus is in effect S&P saying that they expect Greek debt eventually to be restructured and that bondholders will take some loss. In the case of Portugal, as you mentioned, the government fell because of the insistence that the European Union has that Portugal has to take severe austerity measures. Those are comparable to what's been done in Greece and Ireland already as a condition for getting financial aid. Portuguese long-term debt, their 10-year bonds, were trading yesterday at 10.8%. Excuse me, 7.8%. I'm mixing this up with Greece. 7.8%, which is very high cost, and the cost is likely to go higher. So not only does Portugal need a backup facility, but they actually have to have that cost brought down, because what happens in and this is happening in Ireland and Greece right now, is that the bailout brought with it a very, very high price tag, not just in terms of austerity measures, but also in the cost of the financing facility. And both of those things actually work to depress the economy, to reduce tax revenues, and make it harder to dig out of the hole. So it's sort of like you're just going round and round in circles and making no progress, or in the case of Greece, we're actually going the wrong direction. In the case of Portugal, the Spanish banks hold most of the Portuguese debt, or a very large portion of it. And the risk there is that if something is not done for Portugal fairly soon, that the Spanish banks themselves will be at risk, and then you have the potential for contagion. I think eventually what you've got going on here right now is Germany and France are about 50% of the European Union economy, and essentially they're calling the shots. They do not want to extend aid or bailout, as popular people refer to it, without getting ironclad agreement that the nations that are being helped will be fiscally responsible in the future. And so there's been something called the Competitive Pact that is sort of a condition out there. It's not yet been adopted by the entire union, but it's something that Germany and France have been pushing that needs to be agreed to by these countries, and it essentially is giving up a bit of sovereignty, and that's where the tension is. So we'll see what happens, but I'm not optimistic about that taking care of itself without some pretty significant intervention.
I agree. Finally, in your March letter, you talked about the Lords of Finance, a book that tells the story of 4 influential central bankers and their roles in responding to financial and political issues after World War I. The book provided an understanding of the interaction of politics, policymaking, and financial markets that can help provide some insight into current and future economic crises that we're facing. What are the most important lessons that you think that we can learn from our economic history, and why is it difficult for policymakers to apply these lessons to our issues?
Well, that's a very deep and thoughtful question, Michelle, and I'm not sure I could answer it particularly adequately, but let me try. First of all, it's a great book. It's really fascinating just to read because we are able to look back almost 100 years and have the full picture of what was happening, but also know what happened afterwards and so where it led. Whereas in today's environment, we can see current events going on. We could see short-term consequences of that, but it will be a long time before we'll be able to see what the longer-term consequences are. So, for example, we know now that the solutions to World War I, which were reparations for Germany, were very ill-advised. That did not get repeated after World War II, so there was learning. But it led to all kinds of financial adjustments that created extremely large imbalances in the various European economies as well as in the U.S. Eventually, those balances became so large that they tipped over. They tipped over in a rather violent manner, and they also had severe social and political consequences, which actually set the stage for the dictatorships, the fascist governments in Europe, and eventually for World War II. Now, I'm not saying that we're on that same pathway today, but what I am trying to say is that by looking at history, by looking at economic events, the financial interventions that take place, the political aspects, and understanding that dynamic and how the interactions unfold, try then to move forward in time to the current time, look at the things that are going on today, see if there are parallels, and try to understand whether the policy responses are reasonable or they're leading again in a direction that will exacerbate those imbalances or perhaps lead to very dire consequences in the future. So let me give you an example. An example would be one of the great difficulties during the 1920s was the major countries tried to go back to the gold standard, which involved fixing the values of the currencies with each other. And it didn't work for a variety of reasons, but the principal one was that Britain set it too high and France set it too low, and so it actually created a flow of business from Britain to France, and over time that actually accumulated in ways that was pretty consequential. In the case of Germany, they fixed the German mark through the US dollar, and it was done through borrowing from US banks, short term, and eventually that led to a lot of leverage that had to be rolled over, and that game was up after a while. The US banks decided that it was not a good bet any longer. Well, a current parallel examples would be China has fixed the value of the yuan relative to the dollar, and there are many reasons for that, and it is creating a competitive and economic advantage for China. That So far, so good. Everything seems well, but what we know from history is that kind of imbalance, if it's allowed to continue for a long period of time, will lead to consequences. Or another example would be that we just talked about a few moments ago would be the buildup of sovereign debt. That's leverage to levels that actually can't be well supported by the fundamental underlying economic activity of the country. And eventually, if the debt gets too high, the ability of the economy to service it diminishes, and then you have, an explosion of some sort. So that would be one thing, is that just looking at the history is to understand that imbalances, if they're left unattended for extended period of times, usually end badly and have consequences that could have political and social repercussions. A second lesson would be that short-term policy cures are easy to put into place. They're oftentimes politically popular, but they may not be the right cures for the long term, and they can actually set into motion new problems. An example of that today might be what the European Union is doing through the bailouts of these various countries, but they are not addressing the fundamental underlying problem, particularly in the case of Greece, that the economy simply just cannot support the amount of debt that's outstanding. A third implication or lesson perhaps would be how hard it is, and perhaps impossible, this is my cynicism coming out, to implement sensible but tough policies except in a crisis atmosphere. And of course, when the crisis occurs, the damage has already been done. You dug the hole deeply, and now it takes much more effort to dig yourself out of that hole. So an example that would be right now today, which we sort of know about, is the entitlements, Medicare, Social Security in the U.S., are just simply the benefits that are being promised far outstrip the funding that's in place. And if it's allowed to continue unchanged, it will create a financial crisis of enormous proportions eventually. And we know that, but it's very difficult politically to address it. All right. And then the fourth one lesson I would say is greed and debt leverage are part and parcel to our economic order and system. They just are there. You're never going to get rid of greed, you're never going to get rid of leverage, but what you can attempt to do is to contain them so that they don't spin out of control and eventually create these imbalances that lead to destructive collapses or bubbles bursting. So those would be the lessons that I drew from reading that book.
Great, good lessons, good book. Okay, thank you, Bill, for joining us here today. We look forward to hearing your thoughts in next month's letter.
Thank you.